And recording. Hey, everybody on YouTube. As soon as we get the thumbs up from Megan, we will begin. I think we are. Oh, type the characters below. All right, let's try that. Let's try that. And we're good on YouTube. Okay, welcome everyone to the next Water, Wetlands, and Watershed Seminar. It is still spring 2026. We're getting there. And today we're very lucky to have with us Dr. Asena Goran. So Asena is a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Landscape Conservation Planning here at UF. And her work focuses on applied conservation, research in large landscapes. We'll hear about a couple of examples of that today. Particular emphasis on ecological connectivity. Her research interests include data integration and spatial modeling, and also social governance collaboration. So yeah, you may want to preserve a large ecosystem for its ecosystem value, but doing that in, of course, a human context. And so sometimes they call it like social dimensions or community engagement in the process of landscape conservation, and with a goal of equitable decision-making in conservation planning and prioritization. So Sam, thank you for coming. The floor is yours. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Kaplan, for having me here today. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about landscape connectivity and how that interacts with water resources with a focus on the Florida Ecological Greenways Network. I already had a pretty great introduction. Thank you, Dr. Kaplan, but I am a postdoctoral research associate here at UF. My background is in quantitative ecology. I focus on applied conservation research in the land protection and ecological and aquatic connectivity spaces, with a focus on the data integration challenges that come along with landscape scale conservation planning, as well as what kind of turns that conservation science into policy and action, that translational component as well. All of the research I'm presenting today is produced by the Center for Landscape Conservation Planning, which is an applied research hub here at UF in the Department of Landscape Architecture. All the research is focused on large connected landscapes that support ecological processes and wildlife movement, which includes conservation and planning design initiatives such as the Florida Ecological Greenways Network and Wildlife Corridor, as well as the center has leadership in areas such as urban green infrastructure and linear ecology that relates to road and trails. The center also produces a lot of web GIS resources to make data and tools accessible to partners in the state. If you want to learn more about those, there is the Center for Landscape Conservation Planning Hub, which is the central home for all of the maps, data, and tools that the center produces. We've also recently come out with a book on regional landscape conservation planning and the Florida model. This book goes over a lot of the history and methods that go into what is now a common regional planning design, but was pioneered by researchers at the University of Florida, this planning method for designing statewide conservation networks. More exciting things coming from the center in the area of linear ecology. Dr. Daniel Smith and colleagues have produced a guidebook on the planning and design of wildlife crossings, which is a really important component for mitigating the harms of roads to wildlife. If you're excited about the topic of water and connectivity and the intersection between those two fields, there's currently an exhibit called the Wild Waters exhibit going on at the Governor's House in St. Augustine that features a collection of paintings from the late 1800s, early 1900s, and is a way to sort of immerse yourself in understanding the changes that have happened in the landscape over this time period. So we focus on connectivity because species need access to multiple habitat types across their life stages. A lot of wildlife species do. And connectivity is critical for keeping wildlife populations connected to each other to maintain genetic diversity and resilience of wildlife populations. It's very important in the Southeast region of the United States, which is by accepted definitions, a global biodiversity hotspot, which is defined as meeting over 1,500 endemic species and over 70% habitat loss. So being a leader in both biodiversity and imperilment, making the connectivity so important for maintaining the unique ecosystems in the southeast part of the country. In recognizing the importance of connectivity and large connected landscapes, the Florida Ecological Greenways Network is a key initiative in securing the ecological sound future for the state of Florida. It is a living model that describes the best opportunities to connect large conservation lands, create a network of conservation lands that can support both biodiversity and a wealth of ecosystem services in the state of Florida. It's part of the Florida Greenways Plan, which is administered by the Office of Greenways and Trails under the Department of Environmental Protection. And it is a primary data layer that is used to inform state and regional land acquisition programs such as Florida Forever, and is also closely integrated with other major planning tools such as the Critical Lands and Waters Identification Project called CLIP, which is co-produced between the center and other partners such as the Natural Heritage Program in Florida, the Florida Natural Areas Inventory. The Florida Ecological Greenways Network model is stratified into 5 priority levels. It's a prioritized model, where the first priority, P1, are called critical linkages, places that are essential for a functionally connected statewide network. Priority 2 is supporting areas around the critical linkages that increase the corridor functionality and significantly contribute to that statewide ecological connectivity. Priority 3 provides additional network connectivity benefits, including functional alternatives to P1 critical linkages if any of those areas are lost or impeded over time. P4 encompasses important riparian corridors and other regionally significant connectivity opportunities. And P5 is all of the remaining large intact landscapes that support a statewide ecological network. So this is a living model with over 3 decades of history now, and it was developed through pioneering efforts by Dr. Larry Harris and Dr. Reed Noss at the University of Florida, who had this vision to understand and describe the need for conservation corridors and connected landscapes. They were really innovative in this field and drafted the initial maps, such as this one produced in 1987, which show those key spatial priorities, many of which are consistent to the current model because they are very resilient over time. Those areas maintain importance to this network. In the 1990s, the Florida Greenways program, which was led by conservation organizations in the state, such as Conservation Fund and 1,000 Friends of Florida, initiated this Florida Greenways program, and the ecological component of that became the Florida Ecological Greenways Network, which was first delineated, the first version of it, in 1997, and has been continuously updated, refined, and maintained since then. A major step in policy and implementation of the Florida Ecological Greenways Network came with the Florida Wildlife Corridor Act in 2021, which passed with unanimous bipartisan support and identified the top 3 priority levels of the Florida Ecological Greenways Network. Priorities 1 to 3 defined those as the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And this act catalyzed a lot of funding into state land conservation programs such as Florida Forever, accruing about $2.5 billion to date. But it's important to note that the funding for those programs themselves are not in the state law. the continued funding requires ongoing commitment, and the implementation relies on that ongoing funding into land conservation programs to build that network. When we think of the Florida Wildlife Corridor, you might have seen these signs in places like state parks and public existing conservation lands are an important part of the Florida Wildlife Corridor, but only one component. Highlighted here in gray, so these are all the existing protected conservation areas in the network. There are still 8 million acres of unconserved land in the Florida Wildlife Corridor, and 11 million if you look at the whole Ecological Greenways Network. And of those opportunity areas, the unconserved components of the corridor look a lot different than the state park, because a lot of that is in working lands, privately owned ranches and timberlands, which creates unique challenges and opportunities for how do we have enduring protections in these privately owned working lands that maintain the land in a state that is suitable for conservation purposes. If we break it down into pies, those 8 million unprotected acres of corridor opportunity, you can see across priority 1, 2, and 3 in red and orange, those are the privately owned lands, whereas in green is the existing conservation lands. And you can see how that's a really significant portion of the network that exists in private ownership. We know that Florida's landscape is changing very quickly with a lot of rapid development, which in the absence of careful planning can pose a threat of fragmentation to the network. Projections estimate that around over 200,000 acres are expected to be developed by 2040, and over 1 million acres are projected for development by 2070. This is research also conducted at UF, the 2040-2070 projections in collaboration with Bieber. And without careful planning, we will see that those unprotected areas of the corridor and the Ecological Greenways Network could easily be lost. The priority 1 areas that are unprotected in the Ecological Greenways Network are sometimes referred to as the 10 critical linkages. They are named areas of important connectivity which remain in opportunity. If you want to learn more about them, on the Center Hub page linked below, there are story maps that talk about the natural and cultural history of these unique and irreplaceable places to understand the specific conditions and context for each of those 10 critical linkages, which are necessary to have a statewide conservation network. So how are we doing in terms of protecting this network so far over the last 16 years or so, looking at 2008 to 2024, out of, at the time, well over 8 million acres of unprotected land, 960,000 were protected within the corridor, while around 100,000 were lost to development. And you can see in light green the areas that have become protected since the development of this model, and the areas that were lost to development within the corridor. The amount of protected land in the corridor increased from 50%, half of it in existing conservation lands, to 56%. I think this really illustrates how a tool like this can be very effective in guiding conservation investments and decisions, but the need for ongoing sustained investment to create the network and implement those critical linkages across the state. Stakeholder engagement has always been a very important component of the FEGN, Florida Ecological Greenways Network development process. The process is itself collaborative and iterative, involving multiple stakeholders to continuously refine the network, get feedback on the context, needs, interpretation and validation of model outputs, and that includes building relationships with conservation partners, state and federal agencies, policymakers, landowners, NGOs, as well as the public. This feature of the development has been essential for translating science into policy and implementation, as well as garnering broad institutional and legislative support for this vision. A component of stakeholder engagement that has existed since the first initiation of the Ecological Greenways Network is the Technical Advisory Group, which is a scientific forum of multidisciplinary experts from state agencies, universities, conservation organizations, private sector, knowledgeable experts who can review and approve data selection, criteria development, prioritization, modeling approaches, and are involved regularly throughout the Florida Ecological Greenways Network modeling process. This ensures scientific rigor and oversight, as well as transparency, trust, and credibility across institutions in the state. In the spirit of transparency and public open access, all of the information about the Ecological Greenways Network and the Florida Wildlife Corridor, all the science behind that is made publicly available. The reports, the spatial data files, everything can be accessed through our website, through the online tools hub that make it even more user-friendly to access, as well as several publications such as this recent open access article in the journal Landscape Ecology that goes over a lot of the details and methods behind the refinement process of the Florida Ecological Greenways Network that has occurred over recent years. So peeking under the hood a little bit about how this model is built, the foundational building blocks of the Florida Ecological Greenways Network are called Priority Ecological Areas, PEAs. And this is a way of integrating many different resource priorities into one model that maintains connectivity across the state. So we're looking at several criteria of priority ecological areas, and large intact landscapes that contain multiple PEAs are called hubs, which provide anchors, spatial anchors for this model, which are woven together. Those priority ecological areas and hubs are woven together with connectivity models, several different connectivity models that identify linkages between those areas. For example, the Zurich Landscape Connectivity Model identifies functionally connected patches of xeric natural communities between priority ecological areas that include sandhill scrub, scrubby flatwoods, and that's based on soil suitability for gopher tortoise, as well as landscape integrity index, which identifies natural and semi-natural land covers. So bridging into aquatic connectivity, we think a lot of wide-ranging terrestrial species such as bears and panthers associated with the Florida Wildlife Corridor and Ecological Greenways Network because they are focal species that are important to that model. However, many important water resources are also embedded into the corridor and Ecological Greenways Network model. So we talk about aquatic connectivity. We're talking about the movement of water, organisms, nutrients, and sediments across aquatic ecosystems, longitudinally along rivers, laterally across floodplains, vertically between surface and groundwater, and also over time, over seasons, phenology and temporality of aquatic connectivity. So successful conservation of Florida's aquatic ecosystems, we know it depends on habitat connectivity at local and regional scales. And as I mentioned, many of these important ecosystems are embedded into the Ecological Greenways Network. Over half of mapped spring beds are located within the corridor, including 42% of the first magnitude springs, and over 90% of the most intact wetlands in the state are in the Florida Ecological Greenways Network. We know land use practices directly impact the water quality and quantity in these habitats, yet there is insufficient integration between land use planning and aquatic ecosystem conservation, what we do to conserve the water in the state. Some of the challenges underlying this disconnect include the lack of agreement on focal species for understanding landscape scale hydrologic connectivity, broad scale connectivity between aquatic ecosystems over time and space. And one example that made a big difference in Iowa, restoration of wetlands, was a small fish that was found to be very good indicator for landscape scale aquatic connectivity. Finding a good focal species can really catalyze a lot of innovation and action in this field. Also, there's been great effort into it, but insufficient full quantification of the water quantity and quality benefits of large scale landscape protection. Another challenge is this moving non-stationary goal and context. It's unrealistic to think that we will fully return the environmental state of Florida to what it was 150 years ago. And so there's a need to carefully interpret historical baselines and determine what thresholds are needed to meet desired future conservation outcomes. There are many scale and cross-jurisdictional governance challenges in how watersheds and areas are delineated across water management districts, county and state lines that requires a lot of cooperation and innovation in both science and governance to meet the challenges of integration of connectivity and hydrological priorities. So going back into those connectivity models that are foundational to the development of the Florida Ecological Greenways Network, riparian corridors based on major rivers and adjacent outstanding Florida waters designated by the Department of Environmental Protection are a foundational part of the FEGN model, including buffers of natural and semi-natural land cover around these important aquatic features throughout the state. And also pairing that with the natural riparian floodplains, which are a priority ecological area building block of the FEGN model. This is critical for providing habitat and wildlife movement corridors in riverine ecosystems and floodplains, and also has huge impacts on climate adaptation and flood protection benefits of the Ecological Greenways Network. Another connectivity model inside the Ecological Greenways Network framework is the coastal inland connectivity model. Connectivity between coastal and inland waters is critical for creating a habitat mosaic that species need for intact and connected watersheds, as well as huge impacts on water quality, and also is super important for climate resilience, because having development in areas that constrain coastal ecosystems is sometimes called coastal squeeze. That's when sediment accumulation and wetland formation is limited by the location of development upland of critical coastal ecosystems. And so providing space for those ecosystems to migrate upland and inward in climate change scenarios is really important. So the coastal inland connectivity model protects areas with high landscape integrity within 3 miles of projected sea level rise. A recent article digging deeper into the habitat migration planning, comparing coastal inland connectivity models and using projections of sea level rise to the year 2100 was recently published in Discover Conservation and goes into a little more detail about habitat transformation and planning due to sea level rise. Another really critical feature that's very threatened in the state of Florida from if we don't, do careful planning, are intact habitat gradients. So this is similar to the coastal component of intact watersheds from inland to coast, but also from upland to aquatic systems overall. So functional blocks of wetlands and uplands that are adjacent to each other. These are essential for ecological processes, water quality, and species habitat. So we know that coastal and wetland habitats are rapidly declining due to upland development and fragmentation, and maintaining those intact gradients is another critical component of this landscape scale approach to connectivity and aquatic connectivity protection. There are many climate benefits of the Florida Ecological Greenways Network. We know that land protection may be expensive, but it costs more not to. There are billions of dollars, a huge wealth of ecosystem services provided by the Florida Ecological Greenways Network. As we also mentioned, species movement, climate refugia. So as climates and environments shift, there is potential for both species and habitats to migrate throughout a connected network. Natural flood protection is provided by the Ecological Greenways Network, as over 83% of the state's natural floodplains and 96% of the most intact and functional floodplains are located in the Ecological Greenways Network. Protecting those areas provides flood protection for the state, as well as with the coastal inland connectivity model, we see a lot of potential for coastal storm surge protection. There's significant wildfire risk reduction through improved coordinated management and the application of prescribed fire in the Ecological Greenways Network, as well as significant benefits to aquifer recharge. And almost 2/3 of the state's recharge areas are within the Ecological Greenways Network. And that is a lot of what I talked about, enduring protections that keep the land in a state suitable for conservation, as well as aquifer recharge and securing the water future of our state. There's also significant benefits in terms of carbon sequestration and climate smart planning benefits that can come along with protection of the Ecological Greenways Network. Another aspect that we've been digging into more recently is looking beyond the state lines and collaborating more with our neighboring states across the Southeast region. One of these initiatives is the Longleaf Ecosystem Ecological Connectivity Analysis. This is done in collaboration with the Longleaf Analysis, which was an analysis across the entire historical range, 92 million acres of southeastern coastal plain of longleaf ecosystems, and identifying key areas for conservation and restoration of longleaf. Also, especially catalyzed by recent updates to state wildlife action plans in several states in the region, we have more momentum towards coordination and collaboration. There has been increasing interest in incorporating wildlife corridors and connectivity planning into state wildlife action plans, which creates a lot of opportunities for states to come together and see how do those models overlap. This image was produced by one of our partners in Alabama, Kelly Homan from Auburn University, who stitched together the corridor plans of all of the states in the region. And you can see how in areas they overlap and areas they don't, and how that can catalyze working together, more coordinating actions across state lines. A thing I want to emphasize using this quote from the center director, Dr. Tom Hochter, is that securing our ecological future is a time-limited opportunity. The existing conservation lands do not guarantee a connected future, and it's required to have continuous support and investment into this vision to actually achieve that statewide conservation network. We're very fortunate to have the opportunity of being able to still create a statewide ecological network and have that functional connectivity at a statewide scale. And that remains to be seen if we can protect Florida's biodiversity and ecosystem services before it's too late. That concludes my presentation. Thank you all so much for joining me today, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you. It's it's heartening, maybe to know all of the efforts going into statewide conservation, some of which I knew about and many others I didn't. So we will take questions. If you're on YouTube, you can ask your question in the chat. If you're on Zoom, you can unmute. We'll start with folks in the room. Questions start us in. We'll let it stew for a minute.
I see a question.
Yeah.
I'm kind of unfamiliar with like the land acquisition process, but how does it work if these areas are like the different priority levels for conservation? How would maybe like FDP or other policymakers in a county get involved with, like, say a developer really wanted that parcel of land, like how does that interaction usually go about and start, I guess?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Of course, with a very complex answer, but the way these models are useful is that they're a resource for planning tools. When programs such as, one of our main land conservation programs in the state is Florida Forever, and the way projects are prioritized in that model has to do with underlying resources such as the Florida Ecological Greenways Network and CLIP, the critical lands and resources, help inform the conservation value of those projects to help prioritize them. There's always far more applicants and projects in need of conservation than available conservation dollars to date. So that prioritization process is an important use of these planning tools. Counties and regional authorities are also accessing these resources to help plan county level and regional conservation initiatives. You might have heard of the O to O Corda, Ocala to Osceola corridor, which received additional funding, and that's based on having that vision that this is an important area for wildlife movement, for habitat connectivity, and that's how these models can help prioritize decision making. They're not a regulatory tool, they're a planning tool.
We have a question from YouTube. MM Moffat asks, says, awesome talk. I'm curious about when biodiversity priorities and hydrologic priorities don't fully align, how are trade-offs like that handled in the network? So focal species prioritization might not, be in line with, let's say, a water quality or quantity prioritization. So do you find that there are trade-offs that you have to make?
So I think I'll just dial back to the slide where I look under the hood a bit to explain how these layers are integrated. When you're taking so the main concept is connectivity. We're looking at overlaying multiple resource priorities and finding areas that support both these natural resources as well as the connectivity of those natural resources. So that's where the hubs that are made of multiple priority ecological areas act as an anchor, and the connectivity models inform how those pieces fit together. So the integration of these priorities is fundamental to the development of the model, is how I would respond to that. Of course, data integration challenges are prevalent in conservation planning. There are many quantitative approaches to doing these things. One thing I've been interested in is edge effects, which can relate to, if you have an important water resource right on the edge of a species habitat, how do you integrate those two priorities? Of course, there are data challenges, but the approach, this Florida model detailed in the book, this design approach is what overcomes those challenges.
Great. Other questions from the room?
How do conservation easements fit into this?
So conservation easements are an important tool in land protection. Looking back at, not all of the corridor is in existing conservation state-owned lands. Conservation easements are an important tool for interacting with private working lands, private landowners to get enduring protections on those working lands that will maintain the land in a conservation suitable state for long term. So they're an important tool in how to implement the ecological greenways network vision.
So if an area is in a conservation easement, does that mean that it's no longer considered an opportunity that, because it's protected in other ways, and so there's not so much effort to try to purchase?
I would say when we refer to opportunity areas, we're mainly thinking of lands that have no conservation protections on them at present.
Do you see any layers that would be desirable to add to any of your interpretations here? I'm just, thinking of some water quality related layers, things like TMDLs and whatnot, and whether that would change any priorities or maybe emphasize some other protective mechanisms that aren't, that they're outside the footprint, but could definitely have impacts within, the corridors or otherwise some ecological, critical areas because they're being impacted from outside, but curiosity is just whether there's any additional layers that would be beneficial to help guide any of this.
I would say absolutely, and that's a lot of the stakeholder engagement process. I know the dark sky regions is a more recently incorporated component of the ecological greenways network. Definitely always looking to find, it's based on the best available spatial data and has been since 1997. Of course, over that time, the best available data has fortunately evolved and progressed. So I think it's really important to continue working with all the stakeholders to keep updating, refining the network model to use the best available data at the time. Super important.
Do you find that when you produce a new map or a new tool that the real estate market adjusts?
That is a very good question. I think we'll probably learn more about that through more collaborations with Beaver, the economic side of the ecological greenways network model has been a very exciting area of research that's ongoing, very emergent field. So I'm hoping that we'll have more to talk about in terms of analyzing those economic trends in the real estate market and soon.
Just out of curiosity, did you ask that from the standpoint of these hotspots potentially being targets for development and the expectation that that might drive up a response from the state, or was that?
Yeah, the idea that, if you identify conservation priority lands on private land, then it might increase their value in hopes of some sort of acquisition from the state or the county, sort of saying like, yeah, these are important to us, and so therefore,
Value goes up.
the value might go up. Which would of course argue for a variety of conservation tools from straight up, a fee simple acquisition all the way to just education, like the entire gradient of conservation tools, but it's a thing that happens, right?
For sure, yeah, and there's very good evidence that, so there were several ballot initiatives in recent legislative cycles about investments into land protection, and there's good evidence that being near to conservation areas can significantly increase property values. So that's very encouraging for a lot of landowners, homeowners to support things like ballot initiatives that do, maybe dock stamps or other tools for getting investment into land conservation, because it does benefit across the community, both in terms of ecosystem services as well as economic opportunities. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, on the slide with the moon, there was one slide that has a moon, there's a map with, yeah. I don't know how helpful.
Yeah, I know which slide. This
Yeah,
one, there.
Yeah, so I don't know exactly where, but in the middle, there's like this orange blotch that kind of like cross this kind of like link with, like there in the middle. It's like, yeah, there, I mean, somewhere south, east of Orlando, or how do I do this? Where is it? Or is it? Oh, village, right? I just wonder what the orange blotch is.
This is an area sometimes referred to as the last green thread. The Corridor Foundation, which is one of our important partners, has recently produced a short film, which you can check out on YouTube, that talks about this very critically important and area, this critical linkage that is situated in an area with rapid development and the sort of the planning and experience of this region. It's called The Last Green Thread. It's on YouTube. I highly recommend to check it out if you're interested in that.
And what's
Space layer.
this conservation area, like right here, what's the existing conservation area?
So I will go through the, so
Yeah.
within this is just south of Orlando, this is the Last Green Thread area here. And it is sort of adjacent to the Ocala St. John's Kissimmee critical linkage along the coast. Whereas this in here would be priority 2, so it's within the corridor, but is not a priority 1 because it's almost an alternative route to the critical linkage on the eastern coast, which connects the Ocala St. John's Kissimmee region. But it's also a very important area that provides, its own unique challenges and opportunities due to the ongoing development and the planning around that development, threats of fragmentation in that region.
So like, used
Green
to be
swamp.
citrus area too, a lot of
Mhm.
citrus was in there, and Claremont, and. So I wonder if that also was pressure for conversion when that went out of agriculture.
Yeah, there's a new threats model coming out this year from the Center for Landscape Conservation Planning that integrates sort of development, solar, roads, different aspects of mining threats and how those interact with fragmentation and natural resource priorities to look at what we sometimes refer to as bottlenecks within the corridor, critical areas that are undergoing a lot of threat from different approaches. So there'll be more about the new threats model soon, something to share. Excited to share. Yes.
Yeah, one thing that our group that kind of tried to look at the water benefits of the corridor, we talked about, I know there's interest in keeping working lands in the corridor, so working ranch lands, working timberlands. And we're a little concerned because in particular pasture lands tend to be a pretty big nutrient source for downstream waters. And recommended thinking about encouraging or requiring best management practices into conservation easements. I'm just curious if that has gone anywhere. Do conservation easements restrict, say, stocking densities or things like that?
So BMP's best management practices are involved. And so, for example, rural and family protection lands, RFLPP, is one of the main land acquisition programs that relates to conservation easements with working lands and includes some requirements for using best management practices and BMPs. And to, just maintain that land is as conservation compatible of a state in perpetuity, because those are perpetual conservation easements that include, each easement is different, but includes many different aspects such as the integration of the BMPs.
All right, if there are no more questions, let's thank Asena one more time. Thank you so much for sharing about the Florida Greenways Ecological Network. Hopefully we can have an update in a couple years and tell us what percentage has now been. And so everyone, for next week, you had a week off last week. Next week we will have with us is Zachary Siders. He's going to be talking about freshwater turtles as integrators of aquatic ecosystem health, and that will be an in-person seminar. So until then, get your abstracts in. I'm only 2 weeks behind.